Achtung, or you know what? What is Japanese for Achtung? James Holland, do you know?
No.
Because we're going for once on this podcast on Weird Ways of Making You Talk. We're going to talk about the war in the Far East, rather than our normal digressions into Normandy. We've been beat up this week on the podcast. We've been beaten up on Twitter this week for always digressing to Normandy somehow. So we're going to manage to not do that, and we're delighted to be joined by someone who's going to be able to enlighten us and guide us and teach us all sorts of interesting things about that theatre of the war. Rob Lyman, welcome, Rob. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, both. It's a great pleasure to be on this remarkable show.
And Rob, I'm particularly thrilled you're on because we're old pals these days, and of course you and I had that amazing trip to Imphal and Kohima a couple of years back. And what a trip that was!
It was remarkable. I mean, I laugh to myself now because at one stage we were sitting in Calcutta enjoying ourselves, and you said, "Come on, let's go out to Barrackpore." Slim was there; that was where his headquarters was. Let's make the journey. And I said, "Oh, wow, it's a bit of a pain. It's quite a long way out." Do you know what? It was one of the most amazing journeys I've ever taken because we went to the seat of. It was all run down. They were doing it up, but it was the location where all those big plans for 1943-44 were cooked up. I mean, it's a horrible place, but it's quite atmospheric. It's remarkable seeing it there. It hadn't really changed much since the war.
Apart from all the pigeon shit on the floor. There was lots of pigeon poo.
There's a lot of that, yeah. But I have to say, I saw a little bit of your character as well, James, sort of walking nonchalantly into this old headquarters building where lots of Indians were hammering away and replacing windows and sawing and doing all sorts of stuff as though you owned the place. It was absolutely fabulous.
What is it now? What's the building now?
It was a police headquarters. It's in the middle of a police there's a garrison in Barrackpore, and I suspect it's just been rebuilt for them.
Right.
But it's interesting, Al, because
fantastic.
before when Slim took over as acting commander of Eastern Army in the summer of 1943, that was the headquarters. So that's where he moved, and he didn't like it because it was in the kind of sort of northern suburbs of Calcutta and Barrackpore, surrounded by kind of slums. It was on the banks of the Hooghly. And he just felt it was too difficult to get to the front. It was too sort of stuck away, and it was just sort of too easy for all that. There was a sort of big compound around there, and when Rob and I were driving around, you could see lots of sort of old Nissen huts and buildings and that kind of classic British Army colonial military style that's so sort of distinctive. And you could see, and his feeling was that it was too easy to get distracted here, that you weren't kind of properly focused. So after he then became permanent commander and renamed it 14th Army, he then looked for a new headquarters from where he could get to the front in the Arakan and to the front up and around Imphal much more easily. I mean, moving around anywhere in that part of the world is not easy, and it certainly wasn't easy then in 1943, 1944. And he actually moved it to a place called Camilla, which is now in Bangladesh, I think.
Yes.
So we were there, but we were sort of looking at it from the point of view of when he took over. And what's interesting about that time is that is when he was sort of sat down and thought, okay, what is it that we need to do to kind of sort this army out, and how are we going to win against the Japanese? And it was just remarkable to be there at this place where it all happened.
I think the other thing that's very interesting about Barrackpore is that Slim's idea was that he needed to be closer to the front, as James says. He needed to get to Camilla because it was equidistant, really, between Arakan and northern Assam, where the battles would take place in 1944. But as he went forward, his place at Barrackpore was actually taken by the 11th Army Group, so General Gifford, who came from Delhi all the way across to Barrackpore. So the whole of the army's focus, you have this idea in the First World War of the chateau general sitting a long, long way from the front. As Slim said, generals have got to be at the front. You've got to be there. You've got to be close to the action. And he had a really fruitful relationship with the RAF, which is not always the case, as you know. And the RAF gave him an Anson aircraft in order to be able to fly from Camilla to Arakan, then up again to Lalagat and some of the airfields in Assam. And he said it was a battered old beast, but never ever failed him. So he could, if he wanted, he could fly from Camilla to Lalagat into Imphal and back again, all in a day. See his corps commander in Imphal, pop into Dimapur where there's a little rough airfield. You can still land there today. It's always underwater in the monsoon, but it's quite remarkable. And that gave him legs, which he didn't have if he was in Barrackpore. It was just too far away.
A big part of the change that's happening at that time, though, isn't it, is that the war in the Middle East is settled now. So the Indian Army, because up to that point, the Indian Army has sort of been Imperial Fire Brigade, hasn't it? Wherever there's a problem, the Indian Army gets sent. So it spends a lot of time in North Africa and also, in fact, all over. Sort of east of Dover, really, wherever there's anything happening, the Indian Army's present, and that then ends. And so part of what Slim's able to do is there's only one thing for him to focus on now, because after all it's 14th Army, but he is an Indian Army commander, isn't it?
Absolutely right. I mean, it's a fascinating story because it's important to call it an Imperial Fire Brigade. I mean, I describe really the Indian Army as a constabulary. It was a particularly lightly armed constabulary. When I tell people that actually in a company, an Indian company, an infantry company, there were 3 Lewis guns. I mean, they basically had a Lewis gun per platoon. It was rifles and Lewis guns. They didn't have hand grenades. The boys weren't taught how to use hand grenades. There were no heavy weapons. A significant lack of automatic firepower, which was one of the forgotten factors in the collapse in 1942. The Japanese arrived with 3 automatic weapons per section, and the poor old Indian soldiers had never ever seen or heard an automatic weapon, or many of them, because they were relatively new recruits, had never seen them before. So the problem is that this sort of almost paramilitary, it's a bit unfair to describe it as paramilitary, but certainly a constabulary
or militia, like a militia.
Largely. I mean, it was a very well-trained, organised, loyal force, but it was designed to be a fire brigade. It was designed to actually provide manpower reinforcements to the British Army, so that the British Army could go away and do the bulk of the fighting, supported where necessary by increasingly well-trained Indian soldiers. That was the story of North Africa and Italy, but actually where the British would take the lead. So, as you say, in 1943, things were completely different. And the Indian Army had expanded dramatically in between 1940 and 42. I mean, so dramatically, in fact, that the Indian Army began with 192,000 men in 1939. By the end of 1940, there were nearly 900,000. And the entire war, 2.5 million men and women volunteered for the Indian Army. But I think this is the crux of the whole thing. I mean, I've often described Slim as being a lucky general. He was lucky in the sense that in 1943, he effectively received a new army, this newly recruited Indian Army that hadn't been bloodied in Burma in 1942 and hadn't suffered the defeat in Arakan. He had the opportunity of taking these new soldiers, new units, and training them, molding them in the fashion that he wanted. So one of the great forgotten stories about 1942 is that he was actually dealing with a phenomenally different army to that which India had begun in 1939. I think it's a story, actually, just as an aside, that India is only just now waking up to. There's really good historians in India and publicists who are pushing the idea, which I really, really strongly support, that actually the army that ended the war in 1945 was an Indian army in Burma. It was only 10% of the 14th Army, of course, was British. 78% was Indian. And it was, for the first time, a national army. It wasn't the constabulary that had begun in 1939. So the war changed enormous number of things, not least of all the standing of the army in India. And it was absolutely phenomenal. It really was extraordinary. I mean, just as you've been talking about, the army in Normandy, the British Army in Normandy was largely a new army. It was a bunch of youngsters who were in short trousers at the start of the war.
Yeah, yes. There is a parallel there, isn't there? Because after all, there is the repeated pattern through the war, which is Allies get caught with trousers down. pull trousers up, possibly even buy new trousers, and then engage in this sort of massively built up shattering of the enemy thing. And of course, the problem is always that the enemy is incredibly well motivated. Otherwise, things would be over much more quickly. You should. We talk about this again and again on the podcast. Germany's done by 43. Japan is effectively done by the end of 44. There's not another year in it, or there oughtn't be. Yeah. And you do have, because you have the second BEF, or whatever you want to call it, in Normandy, is absolutely is a new iteration, and has fresh training, and the Eighth Army, units in the Normandy battle, they stand out because they're old, because they're and there's different expectations of them.
And they don't really want to be there.
They don't really, not particularly interested in
the other parallel I think is really interesting is that what you see is Britain is defeated in France in 1940, and the army sort of goes back over the Channel, and yet just a little bit over 2 years later is the Battle of Alamein, and they never go, in Europe they never go backwards again, and actually 2 years to go from a kind of sort of very small 10 division army where you've still got a lot to learn, to being in a position where you can absolutely crush and ultimately then win an entire theatre campaign, is not very long. And it's the same thing in the Far East, because what you get is, you get the terrible catastrophic defeat in Burma in from sort of May onwards, 1942. 2 and a bit years later, in sort of February, March 1944, it's completely transformed and in a situation where it can win again. First holding its own at the admin box in the Arakan, and then secondly, of course, arguably, and which you have argued, Rob, Britain's greatest battle, the Battle of Imphal, which obviously includes Kima as well. So it is, in a way, that transformation in just 2 years on both occasions in 2 completely different parts of the world, in 2 completely different theatres, is quite an achievement, I think. When you're going, when in both cases you're having to go back to ground zero. After Dunkirk, it's ground zero. You've got to start all over again. You've got to completely build up a new army from kind of 10 divisions to 55. And again, what you're saying with the Indian Army, Rob, it's been defeated. It's been defeated in Burma. Under Irwin, it try and go in the Arakan fighting kind of European tactics, and when asymmetric tactics are required, it's a complete failure, absolute disaster. It's ground zero again in the summer of 1943, and that build-up in such a short period of time is incredible, really.
I think it is actually an amazing story. But if you boil it all down, the story you've just described, boil it down to the nuts and bolts, you've got about 6 months. So Slim had about 6 months to train his new army. So just imagine that. As you said, the army, Irwin's been absolutely humiliated in Arakan. The British/Indian Army had a British and Indian Army. It was the Indian Army, not the British Army. And but
Rob, sorry to interrupt, but it's just worth pointing out for those who don't know that Arakan is the northwest bit of Burma. So basically, it's accepted that there's only 2 real routes in and out of Burma. One is on the Arakan, which is on the coast, and that is now Rakhine State, where the Rohingyas are and where all the troubles are in Burma at the moment. And then there is, 800 miles further up the track to the northeast, through down the Tiddim Road and across the.
Well, it's worth actually just taking a few moments just to describe why this was all important, because Burma was, of course, a stepping stone to Malaya and Singapore. It was also an important British colony, and the Brits clearly wanted to have it back, even though the Americans were always suspicious of Southeast Asian Command, which they dubbed saving England's Asian colonies. But there were really important reasons for the recovery of Burma. But if you looked at Burma, the best way of getting there was actually, as James described, going down through the Arakan coast, because you could just sort of hop, skip and jump to Rangoon via Akyab, which was the capital, now known as Sittwe. But we the Brits, rather in their complacency, thought that it would be relatively easy just to push down in a conventional way through Arakan and recover it and seize Akyab, 300 miles flying from Akyab to Rangoon. So pretty direct route, and it's really the only way in which you could progressively get to Rangoon without having to fight through northern Burma, which Churchill had a number of fantastic descriptions for it. One of them was jumping into the sea to wrestle with a shark, which I always love. The other one was unpicking the porcupine quill by quill. You don't want to do it the hard way. You want to do it the easy way. Unfortunately, Arakan in 42-43 proved to be very hard because we deployed precisely the same tactics. I mean, with good British troops, by the way, good British troops and good Indian troops, well-trained Indian troops. We just had no idea how to stop the Japanese advance and how to smash their defensive positions. But I'm going back to the first point about 1943. So at the end of the Arakan debacle, Slim effectively had 6 months to rebuild the army. And what a challenge that is. I mean, it's you think about the many years that the Wehrmacht had, of course. But of course, there was a lot of change in 1943. Not only was there the establishment of Southeast Asia Command with Lord Louis Mountbatten, which was phenomenally important and very successful, but also we had Auchinleck coming in to take over from Wavell as Commander-in-Chief in India. Well, that was absolutely pivotal. Auchinleck was the unsung hero of the reconstruction of the Indian Army in 1943-44. Some great books on this last few years. Daniel Marston's written a brilliant book called Phoenix, the rebuilding of the Indian Army, or a title similar to that. And he makes this point that there had to be brains behind the rethinking about how the Japanese could be defeated. And this is why actually Slim and Auchinleck, well, there's a lot of serendipity here. Slim just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Auchinleck was in the right place at the right time because, of course, he'd been sacked from the Middle East. He was kicking his heels in Rawalpindi, I think, not knowing whether he'd ever have a job to do again. And then Lord Linlithgow was effectively retired as the viceroy, and Wavell was kicked upstairs. So it all the jigsaw puzzles moved. And Auchinleck ended up being, he was a fabulous man. Very interesting. Both of them were Indian Army, as you said at the start, Al. They loved the Indian Army. They loved Indian soldiers. They could relate to them in a way that British generals just couldn't. And it's very interesting looking one by one across all those generals in the Far East who were very successful. Indian Army officers, with one exception, Uvri Roberts, who commanded the 23rd Indian Division at Imphal and then into Burma in 1945, were Indian Army officers. Uvri Roberts, by the way, he was a Royal Engineer.
Oh, there we go.
I give it a pass for that.
So what is it about the Indian Army that equips people for this? And also, but the other thing, I think, it's all very well all this people at the top. How do you get that all the way down to the bottom,
Yeah.
especially when politically motivated the Indian Army at this time where independence has been, you've had the interwar years have been a period of great gains for Congress, and there's been all sorts of discussion about before the war's even on the horizon. What actually is India? Where's its role? What's the British government actually going to do? And the British government kicking the can a bit. Churchill, of course, famously not disposed to any kind of Indian independence at all.
Yeah.
How do you get the havildars at the bottom to train the men?
Yes.
I mean, this is the most remarkable thing, isn't it? Because it's not like it's British people all the way down the sort of Christmas tree. How do you do it?
It's a great question, and look, I'll try and get to the nub of it quickly. Although there's quite a complicated response here, and I'm going to really annoy people by saying it's important that we understand the essential duality in human nature that can accept the need for independence on one hand, but also the need to fight the fascists on the other. And I came to this in about 1991. I was interviewing an Indian veteran, and I said to him, in my arrogant British way, I said, why do you fight for the Raj? And he looked at me as though I was mad. And he said, Rob, I wasn't fighting for the Raj. I was fighting for India. I said, I didn't know, I was 18. I'd just come out of school. I didn't know who was governing the country or its constitutional arrangements. It was an irrelevance to me. And he said, I did know one thing. And I said, what was that? He said it was Nanking. And I suddenly thought, okay, that was 1937. Wow. He knew. He said we had a free press. We all read the newspapers. We knew what the Japanese were doing in China, and we knew that was not a regime that we wanted to have any truck with. So when you look at the 2.5 million Indians who volunteered to join the Indian armed forces, most of them into the Indian Army between 1939 and 1945, the vast bulk of them coming through in 1942 and 43, they did so of their own volition. Look, there is a very well-worn argument around coercion, that these people had no choice because they were in a colonial...
yes, and that's the thrust of Yasmin Khan's what the Raj at War book.
Yes,
and it's very much the sort of and it's Shashish Kapoor and all the rest of it. They're all sort of they're pretty down on the whole thing.
I don't accept the argument for one moment. I mean, I think there is merit in part of the argument, but the reality is it just assumes that people are binary creatures, that there's only one choice. You're either a nationalist and therefore you can't fight with the British, or you're you do decide to fight with them, which means that your nationalism has been subverted by the colonial regime. I do think it's not a logically supportable argument in my view, because the reality is that people were making a choice. Those who thought about it politically and in terms of the national aspirations were making a choice to put on hold their aspirations for independence whilst they fought against the present danger. And Auchinleck very famously said in 1945, every single Indian soldier worth his salt is a nationalist. And I absolutely believe that and agree with it. He's right. When Indian soldiers, like this guy who I interviewed said, I was fighting for India. I didn't give a moment's thought about Britain or the Raj. I was fighting for India. And I think that's a really important point, that the concept, the idea of what India might be, not what India was or had been,
right,
was very, very motivational for these young men who were fighting and laying their lives on the line. The idea that you had to be coerced, even subconsciously, into the Indian Army, and thereby to sacrifice your life, doesn't stack up for me.
Rob, why do you think it is then that narrative doesn't have a tighter grip within India today? Because I remember some years ago trying to get an oral history project up off the ground in India while there was still the chance. And I did manage to interview a few, but not very many. And I got, in terms of Indians over there, I got absolutely brick wall of kind of zero interest.
It depends where you go. So, if you go to North India, if you go to the Indian Punjab, the Punjab was always known as the sword arm of India. You have a very, very different attitude to the role of the Indian Army in the Raj and in the context of the Second War than you might do if you go to academic sources in the West. And my experience, having spent a little bit of time in India more recently over the last year, is the academic attitude to colonialism or imperialism in the West, which has subverted our understanding of the Indian Army and its achievements.
Right.
And Shashish Kapoor is, an extreme example of that. In India.
But there aren't any oral history program. There's no Imperial War Museum.
No. Well, the reason for that is that it's in 1947 is a little bit like ground zero in India's history. I mean, there's a big gap. Popular Indian history sort of starts in 1947. Then there's a big gap when you go back to the Mughals. People are really interested in the Mughals. This is absolutely fascinating stuff, but not much in between.
And that includes the Second World War.
Problem. And there are a series of national myths in India, very, very widespread national myths, which are still very, very dominant. One is the Indian National Army. That very small number of men who were subverted by the Japanese or persuaded after the defeat of Malaya and Singapore to fight against
Chandra Bose.
Subhash Chandra Bose, and that myth that the Indian National Army represented an expression of Indian nationalism and was the founding pillar of India is very, very strong today. But my counter argument is, that might be true. The Indian National Army may well have played a significant role in thinking about how we might create a different India. But actually what was much more powerful were the millions of men who joined the Indian Army to fight fascist totalitarianism and Japanese militarism. That was the strongest expression of Indianness. much stronger actually than the INA, and much more effective in the long term as well. And it's very interesting if you look at the Red Fort trials in 1946 and what subsequently happened. It was very, very important that India wasn't seen to be punishing the INA. But as soon as the trials were over and the boys, most of them were let go or finished their sentences, the whole story, the Indian army that had fought and won in the Far East in particular, completely dominated the discussion. The INA just disappeared into history. So it's political, it's very, very political. And it's still very dominant today, but it's been very interesting. I've been tracking this for quite a long time. It's very interesting looking at certainly newspaper reports, young historians, in fact, Srinath Raghavan and a number of other historians absolutely see the Indian army to be one of the founding pillars of modern India, and Pakistan and Bangladesh, by the way, as well. And it was the fact that the Indian army was able to build up to such a formidable extent to become such an incredibly powerful instrument of state and of war in 1944-45. I mean, one of the things that I sort of bang on about here is that, VJ Day, it's absolutely fabulous that we celebrate VJ Day for lots of reasons. But what we shouldn't do is memorialize or over-exaggerate the British contribution to defeating the Japanese, because it was an Indian battle. It was a series of 44-45. It were Indian battles by a largely Indian army, led by Indian army officers, men. They were white, but they had committed their lives to India. And actually, in the Indian official history, I was just looking at this the other day. In 1945, there were more Indian army officers than British army officers in the whole of the Indian army. So the Indian army ended with just over 2 million men in 1945. 1.3 million of SEAC, Southeast Asia Command, Allied Land Forces Southeast Asia as it was then within SEAC, had 1.3 million, of whom 606,000 were Indian. Only 4,500 British officers in the Indian Army at the time. So, I talked about the change from 1939-1945, absolutely massive.
That number in itself surely presents an argument against the conception of coercion, because there's not enough people to do the coercion.
Yeah, the argument, the coercive argument, which is an old Marxist argument about slave,
false consciousness and stuff.
Exactly right. Argues that people did it subconsciously, but I think it's fatuous. I don't think it holds water, because what it does is it removes the ability of individuals to make autonomous decisions. It removes their agency completely. So what you're doing, you're simply saying, well, these people were slaves. They had to, in the old imperial systems going back thousands of years in history, we created slave armies. The Indian army was never a slave army, never. It was entirely voluntary army. They had no conscription of anything. The argument against coercion, I've read it. I read quite a lot, actually. And Yasmin's not too bad on this, but there are some other British historians who push this argument. And it's very tortuous. It doesn't actually make sense. You're actually saying that young Hurricane pilot who I interviewed in 1990 and who willingly went to fight the Japanese because he was terrified of what they might do to India, had no agency. He had no political no ability to make these decisions up. So I'm very strongly against the idea of coercion. And I do come back to this essential duality. We are all, as human beings, have the ability to understand what we need to do as human beings in a time of crisis. I might not like the party that's taken me to war, but for goodness sake, it's my country, and I'm going to join up and do what is necessary.
Now, James is always talking about walking the ground. What other ground have you walked the ground of Kohima and play those battlefields? Because after all, we are talking about Myanmar, so it's difficult getting in and out. And maybe it's easy getting in and getting out. Rob
and I walked Kohima, did Kohima and Imphal together.
Yeah.
And,
so take us through the experience of being in a place like that. Is it built on now?
Kohima, at the time of the war,
is it built on? That's an understatement.
Kohima is still an incredibly atmospheric place. But the extraordinary thing about Kohima, let me just start by saying, look, get to Kohima. As soon as this COVID stuff is behind us, get out to Kohima. It's actually quite easy to get to now. You don't need a restricted area permit, just need an air ticket and make some logistical arrangements. It's 46 miles up into the hills above the Brahmaputra Valley. And when you get to Kohima, it's one of the, well, there are a number of battlefields around the world which are defined by their geography. Kohima is this. There's a jolly great ridge running between two big hills, one hill, big hill, and an even bigger hill, Mount Pullabadze. And that ridge, Stopford, commander of the 33rd Corps, described it when he first saw it as the cork in the bottle. This is the thing that stopped anyone coming in from Burma to get into India. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary physical feature. And we talk about Kohima. Kohima was the Naga village as you're looking up the hill on the left-hand side. Then you've got the Kohima Ridge up the middle. It's got lots of names. It really confuses people. Summer House Hill, Garrison Hill, Kohima Ridge. They're all the same thing. And then behind that was a long series of matted mountains for another 120 miles all the way into Burma, to the Chindwin Valley. So this was the mountain range that sat between the Brahmaputra Valley and the Chindwin Valley. Burma on the right, India on the left. And it really was the gateway to India. I mean, it's an extraordinary place. Imphal is very different. Imphal is fascinating in its own way because it's an old alluvial lake and it's surrounded by mountains. So if you're the Japanese and you're coming across the Chindwin, you've got to climb up into the mountains for about 60 miles across. The road runs up what is known as the Shenam Saddle from a place called Tamu. And as you get up to the top of the Shenam Saddle, James and I have stood there. We've stood in trenches that were dug in 1944.
Oh, it was amazing, Rob. It's one of the really great places to go and do a battlefield study because Manipur's state in which it lies. There has been a kind of insurrection there, and it's been a kind of absolute travelling no for many years, and it's only just in the last few years started to open up, and it's still kind of advised as not being safe to go there, but it's perfectly safe to go there, and it is absolutely remarkable because no one's walked there and no one goes up there, and so there are all these foxholes and OPs and trenches and all the rest of it, and the view from where we were on the Shenam Saddle, looking back across the road from which the Japanese advanced from Burma and from which the Burma Corps retreated into India in 1942, is largely unchanged. So you can, I mean, I love doing this kind of then and now thing where you've got an old black and white photograph and you try and stand in exactly the same spot and kind of sort of marry it all up. And you absolutely could do that. And but suddenly you've got the same view in glorious Technicolor, in reality rather than two-dimensional monochrome, and you've got the smells and the proportions and that sense of scale, which is why I'm such a big advocate of walking the ground. But it is an unbelievably rewarding place to go on a battlefield tour because you can go to Calcutta and you can see where it all started and happened, and see all the old kind of imperial buildings and all the rest of it. And you get that kind of sense of kind of the vibe, and then you move on up to fly into Imphal and you beetle around and you see all these Nunchagung and you go down the Tidim Road and all these places which you've sort of vaguely heard of when you've read your John Masters novel or whatever it might be, or memoir, and then you go on up to Kohima, and the road you are taking from Imphal to Kohima is one and the same road. So much so that on one particular hairpin there is an old Bailey Bridge, spanning the hairpin. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. And it's identifiably the same place. So it's a great place to go. But Rob, I think what's very interesting, just very, very quickly, I think it's worth just explaining. You said Slim had his 6 months to turn things around, but how does he do that? Because it's not just about training. It's also about morale. It's also about logistics. It's that turnaround. So very quickly, just do explain that, because I think it's something that people would be interested in.
Well, the first enemy that Slim had to fight, and the Indian Army had to fight, in fact, and the British armies, the British units that were supporting the Indian Army, was itself. The fear of the Japanese, and the fear that they would never be as good as the Japanese or good enough to defeat the Japanese. So confidence was paramount. And actually that's what Slim did in 1943. The second half of 1943 was primarily about revitalizing the confidence of the armies in India. And that started right at the bottom with good training, of course, good leaders, but training from experienced soldiers who had experienced the Japanese before. Interestingly enough, there was a very significant Australian contingent in the Indian Army in 1943, bringing some very, very powerful learning from New Guinea, where, of course, by 1943, the Australians were absolutely, had learnt all their lessons from 1942, had recovered, and were fighting the Japanese on their own terms, and were very successful at it. So 1943 was essentially a lot of this. It was making sure that the structures of the Indian Army were rebuilt, the units, uniforms, food, weapons, equipment, training, relentless training, day in, day out. But it was also, there was also a little bit of sort of what you would call propaganda as well, because the soldiers needed to understand why it was they were fighting, and why it was worth their while sacrificing their lives for a battle against the Japanese. And Slim created this methodology, which he deployed very well, and it was a top-down methodology, but the troops loved it, which is about proving that the Japanese were, what the Japanese empire represented was evil. It was anti-human. It didn't support what Indians aspired to in terms of their nationhood. And soldiers, when they fought the Japanese, could see this. They could see that the brutality of the Japanese soldier actually wasn't human. It wasn't a reasonable thing to. It wasn't a reasonable way to behave. But what he also did is he gave them confidence in their ability as soldiers. So if you think about sections and platoons and companies, he would send whole companies on long patrols. Certainly down with the 23rd Division guarding the gate into Burma along the Chinwin in 1943, they spent all their time on patrol, going across the Chinwin, going into Japanese-held Burma, beating up Japanese-held villages, finding information, capturing Japanese soldiers. And he did it on an overwhelming scale. He admitted this in Defeat into Victory. He said, I'd attack a section, Japanese section with a company, but it meant that we beat them, and the boys could say, "Yay, we've done that." We move on.
But it's also about teaching. It's also about teaching the jungle's your friend, not your enemy, isn't it?
Yes. That was really, really important, because as you know, James, 1942-43, this was an alien world for most Indian and British soldiers. Yeah. And yet the Japanese, they were no better really in the jungle than the Brits. They just got used to it. They had been trading in Hainan Island and Formosa in advance of 1942. And they got used to traveling through the jungle and using it as a canopy, using it to hide themselves. So that's what happened in 1943. It was quite extraordinary that by 1944, and this is really important, the Japanese didn't know this. They had just assumed that the British and Indian troops they had come across in 1944 would be the same dire lot they'd come across in 42.
Yeah. There's a sort of complacency there, isn't there? And the other thing, Rob, is air power, isn't it? Because what Slim gets, and others seem to understand, is that what you need to do in fight, if you're attacked by the Japanese, you just got to hold firm. You mustn't retreat. Because they feed off what they capture. So if you can deny them that bounty, then you're going to grind them down. So what you want to be able to do is to be able to resupply your own troops, but not the enemy. And the way you do that, of course, is by using air transports and dropping in supplies, but at low level. But the only way you can do that is if you control the skies. And the problem they have up to 1943 is it's only been Hurricanes that have been sent over, not Spitfires, and not the latest mark of Spitfires, like Mark 8s and 9s and things. Yeah. And they're starting to arrive in the autumn of 1943. And the fighter pilots get trained on them to a really high level of intensity because they can't afford to lose these Spitfires. And they can't afford to lose these pilots. So they get a handful of squadrons and train them to within an inch of their lives. So that by the time they're taking on the Oscars of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, they're vastly superior. Their planes are superior, their training superior, and they're going to win. And they do, which then enables, by February 1944, when they absolutely need it at the Battle of the Admin Box, that the guys at the Admin Box defending it can be resupplied from the air because the RAF have secured airspace, because they've got these superior pilots and their superior planes.
Completely right. And the Spitfire arrived at the end of 1943 and completely transformed the air superiority environment in Burma. And it was right. I mean, there was a conception that Slim called air-mindedness. It was saying, look, we don't want to be tied to as he described it, the ribbon of the road. Let's think about looking after ourselves so we are self-sustaining. So if a battalion goes into the field, it mustn't rely on the road to supply itself. If it does need resupply, it needs to look virtue, it needs to look upward. Let's be air-minded. And to be fair to all his predecessors, of course, there wasn't the air transport capacity before 1943 to be able to do this. And we need to remember the Battle of the Admin Docks in Arakan in February 1944. Of course, a lot of the resources from the Hump airlift were diverted by Mountbatten to win the current battle. But it definitely demonstrated that aerial resupply was the answer to logistical problems for cut-off units. And units were taught not to regard themselves as being cut off, but to regard themselves as bastions against which they could counterattack the Japanese. It was an entirely different mindset, a different mentality about regarding your position, rather than bunkering in and saying, okay, I'm in a siege mentality. They said, no, we're going to now make ourselves Slim used to call it a hammer and anvil. We're going to be the anvil upon which the hammer of our counterattacking forces can fall. We're going to go out and we're going to attack the Japanese and cut them off and make them feel surrounded.
But this is so radically different, though, to what's happening in Europe, isn't it? Because all the European armies, the Allied European armies, need road. Yeah. So you do see all the northern European battles basically are for crossroads. They're for towns where 5 roads
and
meet,
nodal points,
and bridges, nodal points, and all this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And if you're not needing to do that, you can fight really very differently. Yeah. I mean, after all, and in Western Europe, the Allies do achieve air supremacy. But I mean, I'm just for our Patreon listeners, I'm reading Pierre Klosterman's memoir, and I'm right at the end of the war, and they're still losing tempests day in, day out to flak and to German fighter intervention. And so there's no way you could have run the war in the West like this, with these sort of hedgehogs and air-supplied hedgehogs, and using air in such an imaginative and different way to the way they're doing it in the forest. It's one of the strengths, isn't it, in a way, of the way the British Army, and the Indian Army, because basically you've got a blank slate tactically. Yeah, and no one's between the wars, no one's really. The trainings from major generals down is a divisional thing. There is no training overview. So when you figured out a problem, the army commander could go, right, this is how we're going to do it, and we're going to need to tie in with air, and then you train from your situation rather than having the German mindset, which is the other way round, which is like, this is how we do it.
Well, Al, I mean, that's the rub. The rub here is that yes, there was a blank sheet in the Far East, but you also needed to have brains. You need to have the generals who can actually who were flexible enough not to say, well, this is the template, we've used it before, it's been successful elsewhere, we're going to apply that, which was the story, frankly, of 42 and 43 in Arakan, with successive brigade and divisional commanders, even the corps commander Irwin, just not understanding that this was an opportunity for him to think, forgive me, outside the box, to do things differently.
But Rob, I mean, what I think is really interesting is that, at Imphal, 2 entire divisions are flown in. I mean, that's just amazing by 1944 standards.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that you've really brought to my attention in the past, and we've discussed a lot on our own, is this notion that there's so much focus when we talk about 14th Army on Slim and his unquestioned brilliance, but his immediate subordinates are kind of left out of the narrative. You've got to be really keen to kind of know who Punch Cowan is, or who Uvery Roberts is, or Stopford, or But these guys are really quality. Frank Messervy and these guys. Yeah. They're absolutely tops, and they all get it, and they're all singing from the same hymn sheet, and they're all tactically flexible and imaginative, and willing to think out of the box, and outrageous and courageous, and all those things, that sort of physically and morally, in a way that you don't need actually in the Western Hemisphere, Western theatre. And I think this is one of the, we constantly faced with this sort of criticism that kind of sort of British armies in the Allied armies in the West are terribly stodgy and boring and all the rest of it. You don't need to be anything other than stodgy and boring in Northwest Europe.
Yeah. Yeah.
In Burma, in Northeast India, you absolutely do. And when we need to have brilliant, tactically flexible commanders, we have them.
Yeah, absolutely. But that wasn't the story up until 1943. 43, it all changed, in part because Slim sat down with Mountbatten and allocated his corps and divisional commanders. It's a very important thing to remember. Look, in 1942, we effectively had one experienced corps commander in India, one experienced battlefield commander, and that was Noel Irwin, who commanded the 4th Corps when Slim brought his Burma Corps back. So once the Burma Corps had come back from Burma in 1942, we had 2 corps commanders. We had Irwin and Slim. Irwin was then promoted to command the Eastern Army, which meant that we only had one corps commander who actually knew anything about fighting the Japanese, and one divisional commander, Bruce Scott, who commanded the 1st Burma Division. We didn't have any generals. We didn't have anyone who knew anything about it. India at the time was full of people who were really good at polishing the leather on their armchairs, but actually they couldn't fight. And and the other thing is, Burma, India, wasn't going to get anyone really high quality from the Mediterranean and Italy and Europe because they were needed there. So this was the first challenge that everyone has forgotten about generalship. There weren't enough good generals. There weren't enough people like Slim, who was, really good tactically, very, very exceptional strategically. You could see the big picture in a way that few others could. So, you asked me earlier what was the basic challenge in 1943? Yes, to retrain the army. Fundamental challenge was actually to try to get some generals who would be any good. It's very important thinking about this, actually. I've done quite a lot of work recently on Reginald Scone, who commanded the 4th Corps in Imphal. Look, he made so many mistakes at the start of that battle. I mean, Slim really graciously took much of the blame for not calling Punch Cowan back early enough from Tidham, and then not briefing Douglas Gracie in the 20th Division that he'd be required to withdraw all the way back to Shenham. I mean, Scoon's orders explicitly lay out what needs to be done. But when the order to Gracie to withdraw came, Gracie said, I know nothing about a withdrawal. No one's told me about why I might have to withdraw. I mean, that's just a failure of command. I mean, disastrous. And as a consequence of that, Scoons wasn't invited by Slim to lead 4 Corps in Burma in 1945. But by 1945, blimey, his corps commanders, Stopford and 33 Corps, Frank Messavy and 4 Corps, and all of the divisional commanders were handpicked, men who had won their spurs all the way from the Admin Box in Sanjaya in 1944 through to the defeat of Mutaguchi's legions at the end of 1940, at the end of that year in Imphal. But there wasn't a large range to choose from. You just get the idea that you can take this good guy and that good guy. They weren't. They just didn't exist. And that's one of the reasons. I mean, Slim could not have achieved, you're absolutely right, could not have achieved anything in 44, or indeed the dramatic achievements at McTeal and Mandalay in 45, without those divisional commanders, Punch Cowan, of course, being one of them, who could just let rip. I mean, it was an ideal Major General's war.
Yep, perfect.
Well, as ever, I feel like we've just scratched the surface. We'll have to get you back on, Rob.
Yeah, Rob, come back on another time.
Because we've done the general and the generals, and now maybe we could get some specific in. Because I'm going to just Kohima, Imphal, the whole thing is the most extraordinary battle.
It is
and
incredible.
I think we should talk about that another time. Yeah?
You've got to go out there. I would require no second invitation. I'm sure Rob doesn't need another invitation.
Well, COVID permitting, I'm going to be there next March. I'm also going to do another trip to Burma in November. Again, COVID permitting rather, because as a historian, it's fundamental. You absolutely need to walk the ground, and the more you see it, the more you think about it, the more you talk about it. I mean, I had an amazing time in March this year. I went down to Mollie and spent a lot of time walking around the Sitang Bridge and getting your head around the failures in 1942. I mean, I've been quite critical of people like, the 17th Indian Division at the Sitang Bridge in the past. But seeing the ground and seeing the challenges that these boys face, well, it is extraordinary. When you're faced with AIDA's amazing 15th Army, blimey, how do you solve that problem? Well, you'll have to invite me back. We'll talk about that another time.
Okay, well, let's do exactly that. Thank you so much, Rob. Thanks for talking to us. We hope you've enjoyed listening to this for once. I mean, we did talk about Normandy. But you know, mainly Burma, ladies and gents. There you go. Thanks very much for listening. Cheerio.
Cheerio.
Bye.